1929. The financial house of cards collapses, and the overinflated stock market plunges into a Great Depression.
Nobody told you these habits would disappear. Nobody explained why the tin behind the flour canister, the seeds in the paper envelopes, the neighbor whose cow you borrowed on a Tuesday would all just stop being how things worked. It didn't need explaining. You were a kid. The house simply operated a certain way, the same way the street was simply there. You lived inside these habits without once thinking they were fragile. 20 of them, spread across kitchens and backyards all over the country. All gone now. All real. All waiting for someone to finally say what they were worth. Section 1. Hiding cash outside the banking system. The tin was usually somewhere in the kitchen. Not in a drawer you opened regularly, not visible from the doorway, but somewhere specific and unchanging, behind the flour canister, or tucked into the highest cabinet shelf, or, in houses where the habit ran deeper, beneath a particular floorboard, or inside a wall cavity that nobody mentioned by name. You might not have known it was there when you were small. Many people didn't. But if you grew up in a household where someone had been an adult during the 1930s, the tin existed. The cash inside wasn't a fortune. It wasn't meant to be. What mattered was not the amount, but the fact of it. Some money that lived outside any institution. Some money the bank could not reach. This was not paranoia in the clinical sense. It was a conclusion drawn from evidence, and the evidence had been overwhelming. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 American banks failed. That figure represents roughly 1/3 of every bank operating in the United States at the start of that period. In 1931 alone, 2,293 banks suspended operations. In 1932, another 1,453 followed. The failures didn't happen slowly or somewhere far away. They happened in the town where you lived, in the building you had walked past your whole life, to the institution where your family had kept everything they had managed to save. A bank's doors would close on an ordinary Tuesday, and the money behind those doors simply vanished. It did not come back. There was no federal guarantee, no safety net, no agency waiting to make you whole. You had trusted the institution with your savings, and the institution was gone, and your savings were gone with it. By the winter of 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt faced a banking system so close to total collapse that he did something no president had done before. On March 6, 1933, he declared a national bank holiday, ordering every bank in the country to shut its doors for 3 days, while the federal government sorted which institutions were sound enough to reopen. 6 days later, on March 12th, Roosevelt gave the first of what history would call his fireside chats, a radio address heard by tens of millions of Americans in their living rooms. In that broadcast, he made a single appeal that was as revealing as anything a president had said about money in the country's history. He told the nation it would be safer to keep money in a reopened bank than under the mattress. He said it plainly, as though the comparison were self-evident, because for much of his audience it was. The mattress was not a metaphor. People had actually been sleeping on their cash, hiding it in their clothing, pressing it between the pages of books, burying it in tin containers in the backyard, because those places had proven more reliable than the vaults where they had been told to put it. Roosevelt's chat worked, at least in the short term. Money and gold began flowing back into the banking system within days. On June 16, 1933, he signed the Banking Act of 1933, which created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Federal Deposit Insurance went into effect on January 1, 1934, covering deposits up to $2,500 per depositor at insured institutions. In the year before the FDIC existed, more than 9,000 banks had failed. In 1934, the first full year of federal deposit insurance, exactly 9 banks failed. The turnaround was immediate and precise. The government had solved, on paper, the problem that had made the tin in the kitchen necessary. But the tin stayed. Your grandparents kept it anyway, not because they were irrational or because they had missed the news about deposit insurance. They kept it because they had watched a system fail catastrophically once, and they had learned something that no government assurance could fully overwrite. Institutions could be wrong, and the people hurt most badly by that wrongness were the ones who had followed all the rules. The tin was not skepticism, it was memory wearing the shape of a habit. The post-war economy needed that habit to stop. Between 1945 and the mid-1950s, the American government and financial sector pursued one of the most deliberate confidence-building campaigns in the country's financial history. Banks opened branches at a rate the country had never seen. Savings bonds were sold the way consumer goods were sold, through advertising, through workplace payroll deductions, through school savings programs designed to condition children into the logic of depositing before they were old enough to distrust it. The entire apparatus was oriented toward one outcome: getting depression-scarred Americans to put their money inside the formal financial system rather than hidden outside it. Because a consumer economy running on credit requires money to move through institutions, not sit quiet in a kitchen cabinet. Economists of the period described the high post-war savings rate, sometimes reaching 12 to 15% of disposable income, as an obstacle to the growth the country needed. Spending required loosening. Loosening required trust. Trust required that the specific memory behind the kitchen tin be gently, persistently allowed to fade. And it did fade. Not completely. Not in every household. You can still find people, children and grandchildren of depression survivors, who keep a certain amount of cash at home in a place they don't discuss, who feel a specific unease at the idea of no physical money in the house, who were told something once in a kitchen that they didn't fully understand at the time and still haven't entirely forgotten. But as a widespread universal household habit, the kept tin was gone by the 1960s. The generation that had lived through the bank failures aged out of active household authority. Their children, who had grown up under the FDIC and post-war prosperity and had never personally watched a bank close its doors, simply didn't carry the habit forward. The floorboard stayed nailed down, the coffee can got used for other things. What disappeared with the tin was not just a practice, but a particular relationship to the financial system, the understanding that your money and the system meant to hold it were separate things, and that maintaining some separation was not eccentric, but sane. The tin assumed that the formal economy could fail, and that your household needed a plan for that eventuality that did not depend on the formal economy to execute. That assumption turned out to be correct in 1929, largely correct again in 2008, and never entirely wrong in any decade in between. But it was an assumption that a consumer credit economy found inconvenient, and so it was quietly discouraged until it read as old-fashioned, then as excessive, then as something that only a certain kind of person still did. Your grandparent was that kind of person. The tin sat in the kitchen because they had watched The Alternative and decided the tin was better. Nobody had to explain it. That was simply how the house was kept. You just learned how a generation hid their money where no bank run could touch it, and why the post-war economy needed them to stop. Coming up next, something your grandmother did in the backyard every spring that had nothing to do with flowers, and everything to do with never being at the mercy of a grocery store again. Section 2. The Survival Garden. Sometime in April, before the soil was fully warm, your grandmother was already out there working it. Not planting flowers, not arranging anything decorative. She was turning rows with a spading fork, breaking up the clumps, working compost or ash or whatever she had into the ground along lines she had memorized from the year before. The garden was in a specific location in the backyard, not a location chosen for aesthetics, but for sun exposure, and its borders had not changed in years. It occupied serious square footage. A garden that could actually feed a family through winter didn't fit in a window box. One family history preserved in Missouri agricultural records from the 1930s describes a garden of 5,000 square feet, 50 feet wide and 100 feet long, maintained by a single farm woman to keep her household off the relief rolls. That was the size the job required. The Depression came for the grocery budget the same way it came for everything else. Fast and without warning. Families that had been buying their produce at the corner market found themselves with wages cut or gone entirely, and the market still wanted payment in cash they no longer had. The garden was the answer that required nothing but labor and seed and the land you were already standing on. Common crops across the country during the 1930s included potatoes, onions, dried beans, cabbage, beets, cucumbers, carrots, turnips, and corn, chosen not for novelty, but for caloric density and the ability to store through the cold months. A garden planted in May and tended faithfully through August could, when properly canned and cellared, carry a family from September through the following spring. That was the calculation. That was why the rows were so long and so precisely maintained, and why no square foot of tillable ground got left unplanted. The physical scale of the work is worth stating plainly, because it is easy to romanticize what was actually a serious, ongoing labor performed mostly by women. The gardening was not seasonal in the recreational sense. Planting happened in spring, but weeding and watering ran continuously through the summer. Harvesting happened in waves according to what ripened and when, and the preserving process that followed the harvest, the canning and pickling and root cellaring, extended the work into autumn. Women's extension programs run through land-grant universities during the 1930s actively taught canning technique, and the Ball Brothers Company, which had been manufacturing mason jars since 1884 in Muncie, Indiana, saw demand for their glass canning jars surge throughout the Depression years as millions of households shifted from buying preserved food to making it themselves. The garden and the canning operation were one continuous system. One without the other accomplished only half the job. By 1943, with the Depression behind the country but the war demanding that commercial food supplies be redirected toward military use, the federal government formalized what Depression families had been doing out of necessity for a decade. The Victory Garden campaign encouraged every American household to grow whatever it could on whatever ground it had. At the campaign's peak, an estimated 20 million gardens were operating across the country, in backyards, on rooftops, in public parks, in vacant city lots, producing, by the government's own estimate, roughly 40% of all fresh vegetables consumed in the United States that year. 40%. That figure makes visible what the Depression generation already knew. A country of households that grow their own food is structurally different from a country of households that buy it. It is less dependent, less centralized, and less profitable to the industries built around feeding people. When the war ended and the economy shifted to peacetime production, the logic that had sustained the survival garden began to erode from several directions at once. Supermarkets expanded rapidly through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, offering produce year-round at prices kept low by industrial agriculture and refrigerated transport. The garden's original proposition that growing your own food was cheaper and more reliable than buying it became progressively harder to demonstrate when a can of green beans cost 8 cents at the chain store and required no labor to obtain. Lawnmower manufacturers tracked the transition in their own sales figures. Rotary power mowers sold 139,000 units in 1946, and by 1959 that number had climbed to 4.2 million. The post-war American backyard was being converted from a productive space into a recreational one, the grass lawn replacing the vegetable row as the standard measure of a well-kept property. Keeping a large vegetable garden in a neighborhood of manicured lawns began to carry a specific social implication, a suggestion that you still needed to, rather than simply chose to, which was its own kind of pressure to stop. The suburban housing developments built at scale through the 1950s accelerated the shift. Developers in communities modeled on Levittown, the Levitt and Sons project that began on Long Island in 1947 and eventually housed over 17,000 families, delivered houses with sod already installed in the backyard, the assumption of lawn built into the product before any homeowner made a single decision about how to use the space. The garden required a choice, an active override of what the lot came configured to do. The lawn required nothing but a mower, and the mower was easy to buy, and the neighbors already had one, and the magazines said the lawn was what the good house looked like. That was a powerful set of pressures operating simultaneously, and most families eventually yielded to them. What faded was not just a practice, but the underlying assumption that produced it, that a household should be capable of feeding itself, at least partially, from its own land. The survival garden had treated self-sufficiency as a baseline condition, a floor below which a household would not allow itself to fall. The post-war consumer economy treated that same self-sufficiency as slightly suspect, an echo of hard times better forgotten, and then eventually as a hobby, charming and optional and modest in scale. Your grandmother likely kept a small version of it going long after the scale shrank, a row of tomatoes, some beans along the fence, because the habit had been established too deeply to abandon entirely. But the 5,000 square foot operation that kept a family fed from May through March was gone, and the lawn ran green and unbroken where the rows used to be. Nobody told her the garden was no longer necessary. The neighborhood just made it clear. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just saw how a country of gardeners was quietly converted into a country of grocery shoppers inside of a single decade. Coming up next, what happened in the kitchen after the harvest came in, and why the skill your grandmother used to fill 100 glass jars every fall became something her grandchildren never learned at all. Section 3. Home Canning. Sometime in late August, the cellar shelves filled up. You could see it happening over the course of a few weeks, the rows of glass jars multiplying from one end of the wooden shelving to the other, each one sealed and inverted and then set right side up to cool. The contents visible through the glass in shades that ran from deep red to pale yellow to the dark green of late-season beans. The tomatoes went in quart jars because quarts held more. The corn went in quarts too, cut from the cob with a big butcher knife, the work so repetitive and the juice so persistent that a woman's hands would ache for days after. The pickles went in pints. The fruit went wherever there was room. By September, if the garden had been good and the work had been steady, you had enough glass on those shelves to carry a family from fall through the following spring without buying almost anything from outside the house. That was the point. That was the whole calculation behind every jar. Home canning during the Depression operated on a specific and well-understood logic. The grocery store wanted money you didn't have. The garden produced more than you could eat fresh before it rotted. The gap between those two facts was filled by the mason jar, which had existed in essentially its modern form since John Landis Mason invented the metal screw top in 1858, and which had been manufactured at industrial scale by the Ball Brothers Company out of Muncie, Indiana, since 1884. By 1939, the Ball Corporation manufactured 54% of every canning jar made in the United States. The two-part self-sealing lid that most home canners used, a flat disc and a separate metal band, had been developed by Alexander H. Kerr in 1915 and had become the standard by the time the Depression made canning a household necessity rather than a rural habit. A dozen quart jars cost 62 cents at a supermarket in upstate New York in the late 1930s. A dozen pints cost 52 cents. The investment was small enough that even very tight households could manage it, and once the jars existed, they could be reused season after season, washed and refilled and sealed again until the glass finally cracked. The Ball Corporation, which employed a large portion of Muncie's workforce and understood precisely what the Depression was doing to its customers, went further than simply selling jars. During the worst years of the 1930s, Ball set up community canning operations in Muncie so that apartment dwellers and families, without their own equipment, could bring their garden harvest and process it properly. And the company provided land for community gardens so that people who had no backyard at all could still grow something worth preserving. The extension programs run through land-grant universities deployed home economists to rural counties to teach proper canning technique because improper sealing could kill people, and the government understood that millions of families were now depending on home preservation for a significant portion of their winter diet. The infrastructure around the practice, the instruction, the community centers, the standardized equipment, was substantial enough that when the war came and the government needed households to preserve food so commercial supplies could go to the military, the knowledge was already widely distributed. At the peak of the wartime canning effort, households that preserved their own food received extra allotments of rationed sugar, a direct subsidy acknowledging that home canning was performing a national function. Then the war ended, and the logic that had made the cellar shelves necessary began to come apart. Clarence Birdseye had developed a commercial quick-freezing method in the 1920s, and the wartime investment in refrigerated transportation and frozen food logistics for military supply chains left the frozen food industry with infrastructure it immediately redirected towards civilian consumers. In 1946, Fortune magazine reported that American consumers were still buying more tons of pickles and sauerkraut than of all frozen foods combined, which gives some sense of how recent and how tentative the frozen food market still was in that moment. That changed with speed. In 1947, the two-door refrigerator freezer became widely available, giving households a dedicated freezer compartment that made storing commercially frozen food genuinely practical for the first time. Birdseye, which had spent the late 1940s marketing its frozen spinach as a luxury item suitable for elegant households, shifted its advertising by 1951 to emphasize ease and economy instead, selling the same product to the same women on entirely different terms. Swanson launched the frozen TV dinner in 1953, a complete meal in an aluminum tray that required nothing but an oven and 25 minutes. The tagline the company used in its advertising described the product as something to simply heat and serve, and that phrase carried an implicit argument about what cooking was supposed to be. Not a multi-day preservation operation involving a steam canner and 100 glass jars, but something that required almost nothing of you. The food companies running these campaigns were not subtle about what they were selling against. Television commercials from the mid-1950s showed women in immaculate kitchens assembling meals from factory-processed components with visible ease and visible happiness. The contrast with the labor of scratch cooking and home preservation built into the frame without being stated. The drudgery of making food from raw materials was the thing being sold away from, and the canning operation, with its boiling water and its aching hands and its weeks of sustained attention, was precisely the kind of labor the new convenience economy was promising to eliminate. Framing a habit as drudgery is an efficient way to end it, especially when the alternative is cheap, reliable, and requires nothing. Home canning did not disappear entirely. It persisted among families who had grown up with it, scaled down but not abandoned. A row of tomatoes and jam, rather than the 100 jars that once covered the cellar shelves. Your grandmother likely kept at least some version of it going long after the commercial alternatives arrived, because the habit was too old and too practiced to quit cold, and because the result was genuinely better than what the store offered. But the scale collapsed, and the skill transmission broke. Her children watched her do it without learning how, and her grandchildren did not watch at all. The Ball Corporation, which had manufactured more than half the canning jars in the country in 1939, eventually spun off its entire home canning operation in 1993. The cellar shelves stayed empty through summer, and nobody had to explain why. You just saw how a skill that once fed millions through winter was reframed as unnecessary labor inside of a single decade. Coming up next, something your grandfather did with bread that had gone hard, and why the rule about wasting food ran so deep it outlasted the Depression by 30 years. Section 4. Wasting nothing in the kitchen. Bread that had gone hard didn't get thrown away. It went into a bowl with some milk and an egg and whatever sugar could be spared, and it came back to the table that evening as bread pudding, dense and sweet and indistinguishable in its finished form from something deliberately planned. Or it got sliced thin and laid in a pan with butter and toasted until it was crisp all the way through, which was the end of its life as bread and the beginning of its life as something else entirely. Or it got dried on the back of the stove and crushed into crumbs and stored in a jar to go into meatloaf later in the week, where it would absorb the fat and hold the thing together. A loaf of bread cost 6 cents in 1933, and a bag of flour cost 16 cents, and still nothing was wasted. At those prices, the logic was not about money alone. The habit ran deeper than arithmetic. Wasting food was understood, in the households that had been through the worst of it, as a specific kind of moral failure. The failure to respect what it had cost to put the food in front of you in the first place. The no-waste kitchen of the Depression era operated less like a collection of individual recipes and more like a closed system, where every input produced an output and nothing exited as garbage if it could possibly exit as food. Sunday's roast was the beginning of a sequence, not a single event. The bones came off the plate and went into a pot with cold water and whatever vegetable scraps had accumulated during the week. And by Monday morning there was broth, the real kind, extracted by hours of low simmering, with a smell that settled into every room of the house. The meat that remained on those bones went into Monday's hash or stew, cut fine and cooked with whatever potatoes and onions were on hand. The dish seasoned with the drippings saved from the roast itself in a tin near the stove. The broth became the base for Tuesday's soup. The cycle ran until there was nothing left that could be cooked again, and only then did the bones go out. Leftovers did not sit until they were forgotten. They reappeared. Bacon grease was treated as a pantry staple rather than a byproduct. The tin sat on the back of the stove, or near it, collecting the rendered fat from every batch of bacon, and it was used to fry eggs, to season green beans, to make biscuits, to add depth to soups that would otherwise taste of nothing but water. Chicken fat came off the roasting pan and went into the same category of kept things. Meat drippings of any kind were poured off before the pan was washed and stored for the next use. The idea that any fat capable of flavoring food could simply be rinsed down the drain was not an idea that registered in those kitchens. Fat had calories and fat had flavor, and in a household where both were precious, it was kept. Vegetable scraps followed a parallel logic. The onion skins, the celery ends, the carrot peelings that came off the knife while someone was preparing a meal went into a separate pot or bowl rather than the trash. Nothing in a Depression kitchen was more consistently salvaged than the parts of vegetables that contemporary cooking treats as waste by default. The liquid drained from a jar of canned vegetables went into the soup pot as well, carrying enough salt and residual flavor to matter. Juice strained from canned fruit got thickened with a little flour and poured warm over bread or cake, producing something close enough to a sauce that children eating it did not know they were eating what would otherwise have been discarded. The transformation of scraps into food was so ingrained and so practiced that it did not feel like creativity. It was just what you did with those things. The leftover mashed potatoes from dinner came back the next morning as potato pancakes, pressed flat in the same bacon grease and fried until the outside was dark and crackling. Slightly wilted vegetables went into soups rather than the garbage. Overripe fruit was cooked down into preserves or sauce before it crossed from soft to rotten. Slightly soured milk went into pancake batter, where the acidity worked with baking soda to produce a lift that fresh milk alone would not have given. Every ingredient had a second use, and sometimes a third, and the cook who knew all those uses was not being heroic. She was doing her job. The post-war convenience food industry understood, correctly, that this kitchen system was an obstacle to its own growth. Households that used everything bought less. Households that turned Sunday's roast into 3 more meals needed fewer products. The marketing language that emerged around convenience food in the 1950s did not attack thrift directly, because thrift was still a virtue with enough cultural weight that attacking it openly would have backfired. Instead, the industry reframed the no-waste kitchen as labor, as the drudgery of a previous era that modern women no longer needed to perform, as something requiring skills that the modern housewife was now too busy and too sophisticated to bother learning. The tin of bacon grease on the stove became associated, in the new advertising grammar of the 1950s, with poverty and the past, rather than with practicality and care. Crisco and its competitors had been making that argument since the 1910s, promoting their shelf-stable hydrogenated vegetable shortening as a cleaner, more modern alternative to the rendered animal fats that Depression kitchens relied on. By the post-war period, the argument had become cultural consensus. Lard was old, Crisco was new, and the tin on the back of the stove was something your grandmother did because she didn't know better. The habit did not vanish entirely, not in every house. Long after the Depression was a memory, you could still find a tin of bacon grease on a stove in a kitchen where someone had been taught to keep one. The rule ran too deep and too long in some families to disappear on a single generation schedule. But the children who grew up watching it happen often didn't carry it forward, and the grandchildren didn't know the system had ever existed. Bread went stale and went out. Bones went into the garbage can the same night. The grease went down the drain with the dishwater, and nobody explained that it had ever been otherwise. That was simply how the kitchen worked now. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just saw how a whole system of kitchen logic was reframed as poverty until it disappeared. Coming up next, something your grandmother made at the stove from 2 ingredients that came free, and why the soap companies needed her to stop. Section 5. Making soap from scratch. The smell of rendering fat is not a smell you forget. It fills the air with a heaviness that is animal and ancient at the same time, something between the smell of cooking meat and something older and more industrial, and it is the smell that preceded every batch of homemade lye soap made in a Depression-era household. The work happened outdoors when possible, because the fumes that came off the boiling lye and fat together were not safe to breathe in a closed kitchen. The iron kettle sat over an open fire. The woman tending it stirred with a wooden paddle and did not stop for hours. By the time the batch was finished and poured into cardboard box molds to cool and set, she had given most of a day to the job. 2 days later, she would cut the hardened block into bars with a wire. Those bars would last the household for months. They cost nothing but labor, and the 2 raw materials her house was already producing as a matter of course: saved animal fat and wood ash. The chemistry behind the process is ancient and simple. Fat, any fat, reacts with a strong alkali to produce soap and glycerin. Hardwood ash, the kind that came from burning oak or hickory rather than pine, contains the alkali naturally. A household that burned wood through the winter accumulated ash, and ash leached with rainwater through a barrel produced lye, a brown, caustic liquid that could burn skin on contact, and that tested ready when a raw egg placed in it floated with a quarter-sized patch of shell visible above the surface. That was the test. Not a thermometer, not a chemical kit, an egg. When the egg floated right, the lye was ready. The saved fat went in next, rendered clear and strained through cloth, and the 2 were boiled together until the mixture thickened and changed. One recipe collected by a local historical society from the 1920s and 1930s describes the process in plain terms. Save clean fat scraps from meat, lard, and hog scraps, melt into grease and strain. Add lye gradually to water in a stone crock until dissolved. Pour the lye mixture into the grease. Stir until congealed. Pour into molds. Let stand a couple of days. Cut into pieces with wire. The soap that came out of this process was not gentle. It contained no perfume, no added glycerin, no moisturizers of any kind. It stripped the natural oils from the skin and left hands cracked and red after a full wash day. But it cleaned clothing, floors, dishes, and hair, and it cost nothing beyond the work of making it. A woman who made her own soap, as one oral history account from New Mexico in 1939 puts it, was manufacturing cleaning compound in her own backyard from materials her household generated as waste. She was doing something the commercial soap industry could not charge her for, and the commercial soap industry had noticed. Procter & Gamble had been in the soap business since 1837, founded in Cincinnati by William Procter and James Gamble, two men whose father-in-law suggested they go into business together after the Panic of 1837 sent both their earlier enterprises into difficulty. They introduced Ivory soap in 1879 with two advertising claims: the soap floats, and it is 99 and 44/100% pure. By 1882, Harley Procter had secured $11,000 from the company's board for advertising Ivory, an enormous sum for the period. By 1893, the annual advertising budget for Ivory alone had reached $125,000. By 1905, it exceeded $400,000. That progression tells the story of what the soap companies understood they were selling against. Not other soap companies primarily, but the homemade alternative that millions of American households still produced themselves and saw no reason to abandon. The campaign to reach those households accelerated in the 1930s, when Procter & Gamble and its competitors discovered radio. The daytime serial drama format, developed specifically to be heard by women doing housework during the day, proved a more efficient advertising vehicle than print or outdoor campaigns had ever been, because it delivered a captive audience at the exact hours when household purchasing decisions were being made. The soap companies sponsored these programs so reliably and so completely that the programs took their name from the sponsorship, soap operas. The drama between commercial breaks was the product that kept listeners tuned in. The commercials between dramatic scenes were the actual business purpose of the enterprise. And what those commercials sold, consistently and with cumulative effect, was the proposition that a modern, competent housewife used Oxydol or Ivory or Rinso, purchased at the grocery store, and that making her own cleaning products from a kettle in the backyard was something from a previous era that she no longer needed to do. The proposition was effective in direct proportion to how much prosperity returned after the war. When money was genuinely scarce, the homemade soap stayed because there was no alternative that cost less. When the post-war economy put reliable wages back into American households, and chain grocery stores put commercial soap within easy reach at prices that seemed reasonable, the calculation shifted. The fat and ash method required an entire day of outdoor labor and produced soap that was harder on the skin than what came in the wrapper. The bar from the store required nothing. By the 1950s, the outdoor kettle, which had been a regular feature of rural and small-town housekeeping through most of the Depression and into the war years, was gone from most backyards. The fat still accumulated after cooking. It went into the trash now instead of the rendering pot, and nobody remarked on the change because the change had happened gradually enough that there was nothing specific to remark on. Your grandmother may have watched her own mother make it, once. She may have remembered the smell. She did not teach you how. You just saw how a century-old skill got replaced by a radio commercial, one daytime broadcast at a time. Coming up next, a depression habit that happened in the bedroom, not the kitchen, and why the clothing companies spent decades trying to make it look embarrassing instead of practical. Section 6. Mending and patching clothing. Somewhere in the house there was a basket, wicker usually, or a tin with a lid that didn't fit quite right anymore, and inside it a tangle of spools and needles and a small pair of scissors and a collection of buttons saved off garments that had finally given out entirely. The basket sat near a lamp because the work required good light, and it came out in the evenings, after supper, when the day's other labor was finished. What went into it during the week came back out repaired by the weekend. A sock with a thinning heel, a shirt with a fraying cuff, a pair of trousers with a knee worn through to the weave. None of those things were finished. They were damaged, and damaged was a different category entirely from finished, and the distinction mattered because replacing them cost money and the money was not there. The Depression-era household treated clothing the way the Depression-era kitchen treated food. Nothing left the system as waste if it could be returned to use by any reasonable amount of effort. A sock with a hole got darned, the thread woven back into the gap using a darning mushroom, or, in households without one, a burned-out light bulb held inside the sock to give the fabric a firm surface to work against. A shirt with a worn collar got the collar turned, the outer edge brought inside, and the inner edge stitched back down so the unworn side faced out, extending the garment's life by another year or two. A coat with a thinning elbow got a patch cut from a matching scrap of fabric, hemmed carefully at the edges and stitched flat. Trousers that had worn through at the knee got a patch from the same trouser's hem, or from another pair past saving, and the work was done on the inside of the fabric when possible so the repair didn't show. Showing the repair was a secondary concern. The primary concern was that the garment still functioned. The life cycle of clothing in a Depression household was long and sequential. A garment began as Sunday clothes, worn for church and visits, and anything that required presenting yourself as respectable. As it aged, it was demoted to weekday wear, then to work clothes, which in rural households meant hard physical labor that no one expected to leave clothing intact. When work clothes could no longer be patched further, the buttons came off first, saved in a jar because buttons were metal or bone or shell, and cost money, and could go onto a new garment. Then the fabric itself was assessed for whatever remained. Sections too worn to patch with were cut into rags for cleaning, or cut into strips for braiding into rag rugs, the kind that lasted another decade on the kitchen floor. A household that ran this system correctly never bought a cleaning rag and never discarded anything textile until it had passed through every category of usefulness available to it. The average American in the early 1930s owned perhaps 12 to 15 garments in total. Each one was expected to last. Flour sacks contributed a parallel stream of fabric to this system. The cotton bags that came filled with 25-pound allotments of flour were substantial material, strong enough for clothing and household linens, and by the late 1930s, the Textile Bag Manufacturers Association had understood the opportunity well enough that flour companies were actively competing on the printed patterns of their bags, offering florals and plaids and solid colors to attract buyers who were evaluating the packaging as much as the product. A woman buying flour in 1938 or 1939 might choose one brand over another because she needed 3 matching bags to have enough fabric for a dress, and the company that understood this sold more flour. A flour sack dress was not a symbol of deprivation in the communities where everyone wore them. It was evidence of skill and resourcefulness. A badly made flour sack dress was something to be embarrassed about. A well-made one was not. The mechanism that ended all of this operated in 2 phases. The first was economic. The ready-to-wear garment industry had been growing since the Civil War, when the U.S. Army's need for standardized soldiers' clothing had forced the development of sizing systems that could be applied to civilian production. By the late 1930s, the Roosevelt administration had commissioned a nationwide measurement study, running from July 1939 through June 1940, in which American women were measured to create standardized sizing that would reduce returns and increase the sales of off-the-rack clothing. The study represented the government actively preparing the infrastructure for a future where women bought rather than made their clothes, and that future arrived with the post-war manufacturing boom. By the early 1950s, the rising wages of the middle class had brought store-bought clothing within reach of households that had sewn and mended their own garments for a decade. Replacing a worn shirt at the department store became cheaper, in terms of the time required, than repairing it. The calculation shifted, and the mending basket moved to the back of the closet. The second phase was cultural, and it was deliberate. A patched garment in the Victorian era had been associated with the lower classes, and the post-war consumer economy revived and amplified that association with precision. Advertising for clothing in department stores in the 1950s consistently presented newness as the natural condition of a well-kept household, and implicitly framed mended or visibly repaired clothing as evidence of falling behind. The introduction of synthetic fabrics, nylon and polyester spreading through the market in the 1950s and 1960s, accelerated the shift through a more mechanical route. Synthetic fibers do not hold a darning stitch the way wool and cotton do. The slippery texture of nylon resists the woven thread that makes darning possible. A sock made of synthetic fiber cannot be darned in the way your grandmother darned her wool ones. The industry had changed the material itself into something that rewarded replacement over repair. By the time someone one generation removed from the Depression looked at a photograph of their grandmother darning socks with a light bulb inside them, the image already read as historical. The mending basket was still in some houses, smaller than it had been, less essential, used occasionally. But the system it anchored, the careful sequential life of clothing from Sunday best down to rag, was gone. The basket sat near the lamp, and nothing went into it. Nobody said that was wrong. The store was right there, and the new shirt didn't cost very much. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just saw how a whole generation's relationship with clothing was quietly redirected from repair to replacement. Coming up next, the Depression habit that happened not inside the house, but underneath it, and why knowing how to keep food cold without electricity was a skill that vanished the moment it stopped being necessary. Section 7. The Root Cellar. Going down into it was something you remembered in your body before you remembered it in any other way. The cold hit you on the steps. Before you reached the bottom, a specific underground cold that had nothing to do with winter outside and everything to do with the earth itself. Steady and damp and smelling of soil and old wood, and the particular sweetness of stored apples mixing with the sharper smell of potatoes that had been down there since October. The light came from whatever lantern you carried. The floor was dirt, which was not an accident. Dirt held moisture, and moisture kept the stored food from shriveling through the long months before spring. The shelves held mason jars. The bins held root crops packed in sand. The hooks held cured meat wrapped in cloth. Everything in the room had a reason for being exactly where it was. The root cellar was not a Depression-era invention. It was older than the country. Colonial farmsteads in New England built food storage below ground as a matter of routine, and the practice had spread with the western settlement of the continent through the 18th and 19th centuries, until most working farms and many town lots had some version of the structure, ranging from elaborate brick-lined chambers built into hillsides down to simple trenches dug in the yard and covered with boards and soil. What the Depression did was make the root cellar essential again in households where it had started to seem optional. Families that had grown comfortable relying on the iceman and the grocery store found themselves with neither the money to pay for ice delivery nor the certainty that they could afford whatever the store was offering that week. The root cellar answered both problems without requiring cash or credit. It required only the summer's garden, the autumn's harvest, and the knowledge of how to put things away correctly. The physics behind the root cellar were precise and unforgiving. The Earth at depths of 6 to 12 feet maintains a temperature between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round in most of the continental United States, regardless of what the air above is doing. An effective root cellar sat at least 4 feet below ground level and maintained a temperature consistently between 32 and 40 degrees, cold enough to slow the microbial growth that caused spoiling without freezing the produce solid. Humidity needed to stay between 85 and 90%, which the dirt floor helped to manage naturally, and ventilation had to be sufficient to draw off the ethylene gas that ripening fruit released, because ethylene accelerated spoilage in neighboring produce. Potatoes packed in sand could last 5 to 8 months under these conditions. Properly stored cabbage and carrots kept through winter. Apples in bushels held until March or April if the temperature stayed right, and the ethylene was managed by keeping them away from the root vegetables. What you stored and how you stored it followed an accumulated body of household knowledge that was specific and practical, and passed down the way most practical knowledge was passed down, through watching someone else do it correctly and then doing it yourself under supervision until the judgment became your own. Garlic hung in braids. Beans were dried and strung. Onions cured on racks before going into storage, because onions brought in too damp would rot from the center outward and ruin the whole bin before you knew it had started. Potatoes had to be kept in the dark because light triggered sprouting, and sprouts robbed the tuber of its starch and made it bitter. Cured meats hung in cloth bags from hooks screwed into the ceiling joists. The whole system was a form of knowledge management, a household science that had been refined over generations and that required no electricity, no purchased component, and no monthly bill. At the start of the 1930s, only 8% of American households owned a mechanical refrigerator. The rest managed with ice boxes, root cellars, and cold storage arrangements that had worked reliably for generations. The refrigerator was already being sold as a status object as much as a practical one, its white enamel finish deliberately chosen to signal cleanliness, modernity, and a housewife's commitment to her family's health. A Sears Cold Spot electric refrigerator advertised in 1932 in the American Magazine sold for $99.50, roughly equivalent to $1,700 adjusted for later prices. A significant purchase that positioned electric cold storage as aspirational rather than universal. The manufacturers understood they were not simply selling a convenience. They were selling a category of household that no longer needed to know how to keep food cold without paying for it. The adoption rate from that decade tells the story in numbers. By the end of the 1930s, 44% of American households had mechanical refrigerators. By 1944, the figure had reached 85%. By 1951, it was holding near 80%, with the wartime dip recovering as manufacturing converted back to domestic production. The root cellar's functional argument collapsed inside a single generation. A household with a working electric refrigerator did not need to know the difference between storing apples and storing potatoes in proximity to each other, or why the onions had to cure first, or what the right temperature was for cabbage. It needed to know how to adjust the temperature dial and remember to close the door. That was the entire skill set required, and it was teachable in an afternoon to anyone. The root cellars did not disappear all at once. Rural households kept them longer than urban ones, and families without reliable electricity or sufficient money for an appliance kept them longest of all. The Office of War Information and the Farm Security Administration both encouraged their continued use during the war years, treating the existing network of home cold storage as a national food resource worth maintaining. But once the post-war prosperity made the refrigerator genuinely universal, the root cellar lost its function and then its upkeep. Doors went unhinged. Ventilation shafts filled with debris. The bins rotted. Within 2 decades of the war's end, most residential root cellars in the country had been abandoned, collapsed, or filled in, and the particular knowledge required to operate one correctly had stopped moving between generations because there was nothing left to practice it on. One account preserved from the Depression years describes a man who gleaned local farmers' fields after his own work dried up, storing the produce in the root cellar beneath his house and feeding 9 children through 2 winters on what the earth below his floorboards kept cold. His daughter recalled being afraid of going down into it. The dark, the cold, the spiders. She never learned how it worked. She did not need to. You just saw how a cold room that needed no electricity and cost nothing to run was made obsolete by a white box and a power bill. Coming up next, the Depression habit that kept money moving between neighbors without a bank in the middle, and why that system was the first thing the post-war economy needed to dismantle. Section 8. The Neighborhood Barter System. Somewhere in the documented record of Depression-era Iowa, a blacksmith named Walter Schmidt accepted potatoes instead of cash for his work, and he did not consider this a hardship. "No meal is complete without potatoes somewhere," he said when asked about it later, and there was nothing in his voice suggesting he was describing something that had been difficult. He was describing how the economy actually worked in his town when the cash ran out. You had something someone else needed. They had something you needed. The two things were weighed against each other. A negotiation conducted between people who knew each other, and a deal was made without any institution involved, without any recorded transaction, without any bank taking a cut of the exchange. The potatoes went home with Schmidt. The metalwork went with the farmer. Both men ate. This was not primitive economics. It was the formal economy running in reverse, stripped down to its actual substance. During the Depression, cash did not disappear because goods and services disappeared. The farms still produced corn and potatoes. The blacksmiths still knew how to work iron. The doctors still knew medicine. The seamstresses still knew how to sew. What disappeared was the medium of exchange, the dollar bills and bank credit that normally moved value between people. And when the medium seized up, communities rebuilt the underlying system from scratch. One Iowa woman named Helen Bolton described paying her doctor with corn that was worth 10 cents a bushel at the time of the visit. The doctor accepted it, held the corn rather than selling it immediately, and eventually sold it when the price had risen to 50 cents a bushel. The corn had functioned as currency, as savings, and as a hedge against price movement, without anyone's bank account changing by a single entry. The scale at which this happened surprised the observers who documented it. Sociological field studies from the early 1930s found entire urban neighborhoods where barter operated as a parallel economy alongside the formal one, sustained by repeated transactions between people who trusted each other and understood each other's inventories of goods and skills. Skills themselves became a form of currency with real and stable value. A man who could repair a stove or rebuild a car engine carried something more reliable than paper money, in a town where paper money had proven unreliable. A woman who could sew or do laundry or cook in commercial quantities had something concrete to offer that required nothing but her labor and knowledge to produce. The exchange happened on the basis of mutual recognition, not on the basis of any price set by any market, and the price setting that did occur was local, personal, and adjusted to what both parties actually had and needed. The organized version of the barter economy grew rapidly enough to attract formal attention. In 1931, a small exchange opened in Salt Lake City, specifically to match unemployed workers with farmers who needed harvest labor, swapping work hours for a share of the crop. Within 2 years, the movement had spread to cover a wide range of trades and professions across many parts of the country. Over 300 organized barter exchanges emerged in the early 1930s, structured as self-help cooperatives, with enough complexity that they required their own accounting systems. A National Development Association formed to coordinate the exchanges nationally, and in July 1932, it introduced paper tokens called scrip, which holders could exchange for goods or services of equivalent value at participating traders, shops, and in some communities even theaters. The Organized Unemployed Inc. of Minneapolis issued around $60,000 worth of its own scrip between September 1932 and June 1933, beginning with harvest labor bartered for crops and expanding into light manufacturing. The organization specialized in producing sauerkraut, which gave its currency its local nickname, sauerkraut money. Scrip during this period was printed on paper, cardboard, wood, metal tokens, leather, and in at least one documented instance on parchment made from fish skin. Communities improvised the physical form of money itself when the federal government's version became unavailable. The New Deal moved deliberately to displace this parallel system. The problem with barter exchanges and self-help cooperatives, from the perspective of the federal government trying to stabilize the formal economy, was that they worked. They worked without banks, without retailers, without any of the commercial infrastructure that the government needed to revive. A person who had found a stable way to get food and services through direct exchange had less urgency about returning to wage employment and less need for the federal relief programs that were being designed to smooth the transition back to a cash economy. The scrip-issuing barter networks diminished rapidly once New Deal employment and relief programs provided an alternative. Not because the barter networks had failed, but because federal cash relief reinserted people into the money economy and made direct exchange less immediately necessary. The barter movement's own records note the decline explicitly. The number of groups and the amount of scrip they issued fell quickly once federal programs preempted their function. The individual habit, the informal neighborhood trading that happened outside any organized exchange, persisted longer and more quietly. Eggs traded for garden produce, a day's labor for firewood, sewing done in exchange for childcare. These transactions had no organizations, no scrip, no records, and no one to displace them except prosperity itself. As post-war wages rose, and the consumer economy filled in around the edges of daily life, the practical necessity of the informal trade diminished, neighborhood by neighborhood. The consumer economy required that value flow through the cash system, and it offered enough cash, through wages and eventually through consumer credit, to make direct exchange seem like more trouble than it was worth. A jar of eggs for a bag of tomatoes required a conversation, a relationship, and a mutual assessment of fair value. The grocery store required only money, and by the mid-1950s, most households had enough of it to prefer the grocery store. What dissolved with the barter habit was not just a transaction method, but a particular kind of community knowledge. You had to know what your neighbors had, what they could do, and what they needed, before you could trade with them. The barter economy assumed intimate familiarity between people who lived near each other, a familiarity that made exchange possible without money, and that the money economy, once restored, gently made unnecessary. Nobody told you to stop knowing your neighbors that way. There was simply less reason to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just saw how an entire parallel economy built on trust and skill dissolved the moment cash became easy again. Coming up next, the depression habit of never paying full price for anything, and the specific tool your grandparents used that the retail industry spent 2 decades trying to discredit. Section 9. Layaway. There was a counter, usually toward the back of the store, and the person behind it took your deposit and wrote your name in a book and gave you a ticket, and then the item you had chosen disappeared into a stockroom where it sat with your name on it until you had paid enough to take it home. You came back the following week or the following payday and made another payment, and the number in the book went down, and eventually, when the number reached 0, the item came back out and was yours. No interest was charged on any of this. The store held your item and your money and waited, and you held your ticket and your discipline and waited, and the transaction was complete when both sides had finished, rather than when either side had begun. This was layaway, and the logic behind it was so clean and so sensible that it took a specific and sustained effort by the financial industry to make it seem embarrassing. Layaway developed during the Depression because the Depression made its logic unavoidable. Retailers understood that their customers needed larger goods, clothing and furniture and appliances, but could not produce the full cash price in a single transaction. The installment credit systems that had existed before the crash had helped cause the crash, by putting households into debt obligations they could not sustain when income collapsed. Layaway offered a different mechanism. The store extended no credit, carried no risk of default, and charged no interest. The customer made partial payments on a schedule they set themselves, and the store stored the item until the full price had been collected. If the customer stopped paying, the item went back to the shelf, and the payments already made might be refunded minus a small storage fee or forfeited, depending on the store's terms. The retailer's exposure was essentially zero. The customer's exposure was bounded by what they had already paid. Nobody owed anybody anything at any point in the transaction. This was the habit your grandparents brought to the department stores in the 1940s and 1950s, when the post-war consumer economy came online and the goods started appearing in store windows that hadn't been available before. A winter coat, a set of kitchen appliances, a bicycle for Christmas, a radio. These were the things that went on layaway, held in the back while the weekly payments accumulated over months. The practice required no credit history, no credit check, no signature on a loan document, and no interest payment to anyone. The store that extended layaway was essentially offering its stockroom as a savings account for a specific purchase, and the customer who used it was saving towards something concrete rather than borrowing against something theoretical. The discipline required was real. You could not have the thing until you had paid for it, which meant you had to want it consistently enough to keep coming back, which meant impulse purchases were effectively screened out by the structure of the transaction itself. You had to intend to buy the thing and keep intending it across the full duration of the payment period. The credit card arrived in the American market by stages. The first charge card, widely recognizable as such, the Diners Club card, launched in 1950 and was initially accepted at 27 New York City restaurants. Bank of America introduced the Bank AmeriCard in California in 1958, the direct ancestor of the Visa card, and launched it by mailing unsolicited cards to 60,000 residents of Fresno. By the late 1960s, credit cards were available from most major banks, though they remained less universal than they would become. The event that accelerated mass adoption was the development of the magnetic stripe reader, pioneered by IBM engineer Forrest Perry, which made the transaction fast enough for retail environments. Once the infrastructure was in place, banks moved systematically to make cards appealing. They eliminated annual fees, introduced 0% introductory interest rates, and added rewards programs that made the card seem like it was giving you something, rather than charging you for something. By the early 1980s, the transformation was well advanced. Credit card usage was growing at a pace that made layaway look like it belonged to a different era. The difference between the two systems, stated plainly, was this. Credit gave you the item immediately and collected from you later, with interest. Layaway made you pay first and wait. For the retailers, layaway carried administrative costs, the storage, the bookkeeping, the dedicated counter staff, none of which were offset by any revenue stream equivalent to the interest income that a credit arrangement generated for the lender. For the banks that issued credit cards, every layaway customer who converted to credit was a new source of interest revenue that hadn't existed before. The financial incentive to discredit layaway and promote credit was not incidental. It was the core business logic of the transition. The marketing language that surrounded credit cards in the 1970s and 1980s consistently framed instant ownership as the modern and natural condition, and framed waiting as something only people with no options did. The question the advertising posed, implicitly, was why you would wait when you didn't have to, and the answer the industry provided was that you wouldn't, because you were modern. and modern people took things home the day they decided to buy them. Layaway did not die immediately. It persisted at Kmart longer than at most retailers, and department stores ran it through the 1980s, particularly for holiday shopping, because the Christmas purchase cycle was long enough that the structure still made sense, and customers with no credit or damaged credit still needed it. But the habit itself, the Depression-era instinct that said you waited until you had the money before you bought the thing, eroded as credit became universal, and as the culture built around credit made waiting seem like a personal failure rather than a sound strategy. Walmart dropped its layaway program entirely in 2006, citing low demand and rising costs, and brought it back in 2011 only because the 2008 financial crisis had briefly tightened credit and reminded enough customers that the alternative existed. When credit eased again, the program faded again. The system your grandparents used required patience as its operating mechanism. Patience was incompatible with what the consumer credit economy was selling, which was the sensation of having the thing right now. That sensation cost interest. The interest added up. Nobody showed you the math. You just saw how a system that charged no interest and carried no debt was made to feel obsolete by an industry that collected billions in interest every year. Coming up next, the depression habit that ran on coal and necessity, and why knowing how to heat only the rooms you needed was a skill that vanished the moment central heating arrived. Section 10. Heating only one room. Winter in a Depression-era house without central heating was something you felt in your body the moment you left the warm room. The kitchen or the parlor, whichever held the stove, was where the family lived from November through March. It was where the children did their homework, and where the adults sat in the evenings, and where the youngest children slept if the house ran cold enough to make the bedrooms dangerous, rather than merely uncomfortable. The stove held the room at a temperature a body could sustain. Everything on the other side of the doorway was another matter. You moved through the cold parts of the house quickly and with purpose, grabbed what you needed, came back. The blanket hung across the doorway was not decoration. It was the boundary of the livable world, and crossing it required a different kind of resolve than simply walking through a door. Coal was the primary fuel in most urban and many rural Depression households, and coal cost money at a time when money was the one thing the Depression had reliably removed from circulation. In 1940, according to U.S. Census data, 3 out of every 4 American homes still relied on coal or wood for heat. The coal that came into a Depression household was budgeted and rationed the way food was budgeted and rationed, and heating the whole house was simply not a calculation that most households could make work. The tonnage required was too high, and the income too unreliable. Families that understood this early in the decade organized their winters around the single-room solution, concentrating the family, the heat, and the fuel expenditure into one shared space, rather than spreading all 3 thin across rooms that could not all be kept warm simultaneously. Children from those winters could tell you decades later which corner of the kitchen had the warmest draft and which side of the stove radiated best into the room where you were sitting. The improvised insulation techniques that held the heat in that room were practical and specific. Blankets in doorways were the most common, hung from nails or rods across the frame to block the cold air that would otherwise pull through from the unheated rooms beyond. Old newspapers stuffed into gaps around window frames provided insulation against wind infiltration. Rugs laid against the bottoms of doors served the same function. In houses without these measures, the warmth the stove produced spread and dissipated too quickly to hold the temperature at anything useful, and the family spent more fuel to maintain a lower temperature than they would have spent in a properly sealed single room. The knowledge of where the drafts came from and how to block them was household knowledge, specific to the particular house, accumulated over winters and passed along. In rural areas where money for coal was genuinely unavailable, alternatives emerged from necessity. In Iowa during the worst years, corn prices had fallen to 8 or 10 cents a bushel, while coal cost more, producing an outcome whose logic inverted everything the agricultural economy was supposed to deliver. Farm families burned their own crops for heat because the corn was worth less than the coal it could replace. Children in some communities climbed the sides of parked coal freight cars and kicked loose chunks down to the ground, and the family came later with bags to collect what had fallen. The line between desperate resourcefulness and outright theft ran through the coal yards of every American city that had them, and families generally occupied whatever side of it the weather required. The forced air furnace existed by the mid-1930s, using an electric fan to push heated air through ductwork to multiple rooms simultaneously, but it was not a technology within reach of most Depression households either financially or structurally. The houses of working class and rural families were not built with ductwork, and installing a central heating system required both the equipment and the home modifications to run it, costs that landed outside what was possible in a decade of collapsed income. Central heating was, during the Depression years, an emblem of middle-class stability in the same way the electric refrigerator was, something you aspired to, evidence that a household had not fallen entirely, visible in houses on certain streets but not others. Its absence required a management strategy. That strategy was the single heated room, and it worked because households organized themselves around it rather than against it. The transformation that ended the practice came from outside the household and moved faster than any previous change in residential heating history. The interstate natural gas pipeline network expanded massively during the 1940s and 1950s, with roughly half of the existing mainline transmission infrastructure installed in those 2 decades, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Natural gas arrived through underground pipes, required no storage, burned cleanly enough to put a furnace in a basement or utility closet, and cost less than the alternatives that had preceded it. The post-war suburban housing boom met this infrastructure at exactly the right moment. Developers building new houses by the thousand, in communities modeled on Levittown and its successors, included central heating as a standard feature rather than an optional upgrade. The houses came heated. Every room was in the system. The single-room solution was not a decision the new homeowner made. The house itself made it unnecessary before the family moved in. Coal as a heating fuel collapsed in the census data with a precision that makes the transition visible. 55% of American households used coal or coke for heat in 1940. By 1970, that figure had fallen to 2.9%. By 2000, it was 0.1%. The knowledge that had managed coal winters, the specific understanding of where drafts entered and how to block them, which rooms needed to be closed off and which could be allowed to run cold, how much fuel a given stove consumed per hour at a given outdoor temperature, dissolved along with the practice it had served. Nobody needed to know any of it once the thermostat was on the wall and the furnace was in the basement running on gas that arrived invisibly through the ground. The blanket came down from the doorway sometime in the 1950s and did not go back up. The rooms on the other side had heat now, the same heat the main room had, distributed without judgment through vents in every floor. You could walk through your whole house in winter without feeling the cold change as you moved from one room to the next. This was genuinely comfortable and genuinely convenient, and it created a dependency on an energy infrastructure that the household had no ability to replace if it failed. The single-room habit had been inconvenient and cold and completely self-sufficient. The thermostat was warm and required a monthly payment to a company you would never meet. Nobody weighed those two things against each other at the time. The warmth was right there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just saw how a cold management skill built over hard winters was made unnecessary by a pipeline and a thermostat. Coming up next, the depression habit that ran on trust between neighbors rather than any institution, and why your grandparents knew something about shared housing that the post-war suburb was specifically designed to make them forget. Section 11. Taking in boarders. There was an extra place at the table and an extra set of footsteps in the hall at night that you had learned to identify without looking up, and a name you called the person by that was not the name his own family used for him. He paid rent. The rent meant the mortgage got paid and the house stayed yours. He ate with you or he didn't, depending on what had been arranged, and he had his room and you had yours, and the arrangement required a specific kind of household tolerance that was not comfort exactly, but was not inconvenience either. It was just the way the house worked when the income from one wage earner was not enough to hold the property, and another income was needed, and the spare room was the asset available to leverage. You took in a boarder the way you planted the garden, not because it was pleasant, but because the arithmetic required it. The 1930 census counted roughly 3.8 million Americans living as boarders or lodgers in private households, representing about 3% of the total household population, and that number reflected only the households that acknowledged the arrangement to a census enumerator. 9% of households that year reported having boarders or lodgers, and the actual figure was almost certainly higher, since many arrangements were informal. Many boarders were relatives counted differently, and many households had reason to minimize what they disclosed. The number climbed through the decade as conditions worsened. Married children moved back into parents' houses. Extended family members who had been living independently found they could no longer afford to and appeared in census records as lodgers in their own relatives' households, described in the official language of strangers, because the form offered no better category for people who had come home out of financial necessity rather than choice. 3 or 4 families sometimes shared a single house to split the costs of rent or mortgage, and privacy became something the Depression had temporarily repealed rather than something a household could expect as a baseline condition. The economics of the arrangement were straightforward. A family that could rent a spare bedroom for $5 or $10 a month in the early 1930s, when a general laborer's daily wage was $2 and the breadwinner might be working part-time or not at all, had found the equivalent of several additional days of income without anyone leaving the house to earn it. The boarder arrangement required trust rather than credit, a personal assessment of the person taking the room rather than an application to any institution, and the income it produced carried no interest and no repayment obligation. You either trusted the person enough to let them into your house, or you didn't, and the trust was calibrated by community knowledge, by who vouched for them, by how they presented themselves at the door. This was not a system any bank was involved in, which meant no bank could profit from it, and no bank could foreclose on it. The post-war economy's answer to this arrangement was the suburban house, designed and financed in a way that made the boarder not just unnecessary, but structurally incompatible with the new residential ideal. The Federal Housing Administration, created in 1934 and expanded aggressively after the war, backed mortgages for single-family homes, and made those mortgages available on terms that put homeownership within reach of the returning veteran and the young middle-class family in a way it had never been before. The GI Bill extended those terms further. The houses that went up in Levittown and its successors across the country were built for one nuclear family, 2 adults, their children, and no one else. Levitt and Sons built more than 70,000 houses in its post-war developments, and built them to a formula that assumed a specific household composition and a specific pattern of daily life. The formula did not include a border. Single-family zoning laws, which had been developing since the 1910s, and which the post-war suburban boom encoded into the planning of new communities, made the multiple household arrangement not just culturally discouraged, but frequently illegal. By the mid-20th century, roughly 75% of land zoned for residential use in American cities was zoned exclusively for single-family homes, meaning that adding a renting border to an owner-occupied house crossed into regulatory ambiguity in many jurisdictions, and formal multifamily arrangements were prohibited outright in large portions of the residential landscape. The law had built the nuclear family into the lot lines. The cultural machinery reinforced what the zoning accomplished. The post-war vision of the good household, distributed through advertising, television, and the design of the houses themselves, was a vision of privacy, self-containment, and independence from the need to share space with anyone outside the immediate family. The boarding arrangement had normalized a degree of domestic intimacy with strangers that the 1950s suburban ideal treated as evidence of having not quite made it. A house with a boarder was a house that needed help. A house that needed help was a house where things had not gone as planned. The message was ambient and unspoken and entirely effective. The boarder vanished from the American household, not through any single policy, but through the accumulated weight of a residential culture that had been built, financed, and zoned to accommodate exactly one family unit and to make any other arrangement feel like a step backward. By 2005, the number of Americans living as boarders or lodgers in private households had fallen from its 1930 peak of 3.8 million to approximately 1.1 million, a decline of roughly 2/3 across 7 decades, even as the total population had more than doubled. The spare rooms were still there. They had become offices, guest rooms, storage, the room where the treadmill lived. The mortgage got paid from one income now, or 2 incomes both employed outside the house, and the idea that the spare room could carry a portion of that load had become something no one thought of first. The footsteps in the hall at night that were not family went quiet, and nobody explained that they had ever been otherwise. You just saw how a housing habit built on trust and necessity was designed out of existence by zoning codes and mortgage policy. Coming up next, the Depression skill that involved knowing exactly how much of everything you had at every moment, and why the habit of keeping a household budget to the penny was the first casualty of the credit card. Section 12. Keeping the household accounts. Somewhere in the kitchen, usually in a drawer or on a shelf near where the bills were kept, there was a notebook. Not an elaborate one, a composition book or a simple ledger, sometimes just a stack of folded paper. and in it every transaction that had passed through the household for the week or the month was written in pencil in a hand that knew what it was doing. The mortgage, the coal, the flour and beans from the grocery, the nickel for the child's school paper, the 15 cents for thread. None of it was too small to record, and none of it was approximate, because approximate was how you ended up short at the end of the month without understanding where the money had gone, and ending up short without understanding why was a failure the Depression household could not afford. You knew exactly what you had. You knew exactly what had gone out. The difference between those two numbers was your margin, and your margin was how the household survived. The envelope system that Depression families used to manage this was physically simple and psychologically exact. Cash came in from whatever wages or sales or barter income the household had produced that week, and it was divided immediately into labeled envelopes. One for rent or mortgage, one for food, one for fuel, one for clothing repairs, one held back for emergencies that were never truly unexpected, because experience had taught that emergencies were simply the regular costs of living by another name. Each envelope held what was allocated and nothing more, and when an envelope was empty, the spending in that category stopped. There was no overdraft mechanism, no credit line to smooth the shortfall, no system of deferred payment to obscure the relationship between what you had spent and what you had left. The envelope that ran out said plainly that the category was done for the period, and the household reorganized itself around that fact rather than ignoring it. The discipline this produced was not the discipline of willpower exactly. It was the discipline of a system that made overspending physically impossible rather than morally discouraged. You could not spend money from the food envelope on coal because the food envelope was for food, and the coal envelope was separately counted and physically separate, and if both ran out before the month ended, the household had a problem that required a real solution rather than a momentary bridge. Depression families tracked what was owed to them alongside what they owed, noted the dates when bills were due so that nothing was missed and no penalty fee added to an already tight budget, and calculated forward how much flour would be needed through Friday, how many days of coal the current bin would last at the current burn rate, whether the egg money from the neighbor was due this week or next. The household was managed like a small business because it was one, and the person managing it held the accounts the way a bookkeeper held accounts, in continuous contact with the actual numbers rather than operating on a comfortable approximation. The credit card arrived into this system like a solvent into an adhesive. The Bank Americard launched in California in 1958 when Bank of America mailed unsolicited cards to 60,000 residents of Fresno, and the model it introduced separated the moment of purchase from the moment of payment by 30 days, then by more. The psychological effect of this separation was not incidental to the industry's business model. It was central to it. A purchase made with cash requires you to watch money leave your possession in the same moment you receive the good or service, and that simultaneity creates a perceptible reluctance, a brief internal accounting of whether the thing is worth what is leaving your hand right now. Research conducted at MIT's Sloan School of Management found that people spend up to 100% more when using credit cards than when using cash for identical purchases. The reluctance, the slight friction of watching a bill change hands, does real financial work that disappears the moment the transaction becomes a card swipe or a tap. By the early 1980s, the magnetic stripe reader had made card transactions fast enough for retail environments, and banks began competing for customers by removing annual fees, introducing 0% introductory rates, and adding reward programs that made the card feel as though it was giving you something, rather than charging you for the privilege of spending money you might not have. The envelope system became something your grandparents did, mentioned occasionally with a combination of respect and mild amusement, filed alongside the root cellar and the mending basket as evidence of a harder and more precise era. The notebook disappeared from the kitchen drawer. The running total of what had been spent and what remained was replaced by a monthly statement that arrived after the spending had already happened, after the decisions had been made, after the impulses had been followed or not on the basis of no real accounting at all. What the precise household budget had actually done was make the relationship between income and expenditure continuous and visible. You could not convince yourself that things were fine if the numbers on the page said otherwise, because the page was updated every time money moved and consulted before money moved again. The credit card economy required that this relationship become intermittent and retrospective, that the accounting happen after the fact rather than before it, because the industry's revenue depended on people spending more than they would have spent if they had been watching the number go down in real time. The notebook knew what you had. The card did not ask. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just saw how a system that made overspending structurally impossible was replaced by one built on deferral and the quiet accumulation of interest. Coming up next, the depression habit of knowing how to fix nearly anything yourself, and why the service economy needed that knowledge to disappear before it could fully take hold. Section 13. Fixing everything yourself. When the shoe wore through at the heel, you did not throw the shoe away. You cut a new sole from a piece of rubber salvaged from a spent tire, or from a thick piece of leather kept in the repair box for exactly this kind of occasion, and you stitched and glued it in place and wore the shoe another season. When the car developed a rattle or a failure the household could not afford to have a mechanic address, a man with the right knowledge reached into the engine with his hands, and the problem became a project rather than an expense. When the stove's burner stopped drawing heat evenly, someone in the house understood enough about how the stove worked to adjust the damper and the draft and get it running correctly, rather than calling anyone to come and do it. The Depression household treated practical knowledge the way the Depression household treated food. Nothing was wasted. Every bit was put to use. And not knowing how something worked was a gap you filled as quickly as you could. This was not a particularly romantic arrangement from the inside. The cobbling was unglamorous. The car repair was dirty and cold, and the range of things a household had to know how to fix to stay solvent ran from structural carpentry down to the threading of a needle, which meant that competence had to span an enormous range of materials and mechanisms. But competence in that range was not considered unusual. It was considered basic. A man who could not fix the simple mechanical failures his household produced was not entirely equipped for life. A woman who could not repair and remake clothing was not entirely equipped either. These were not special skills. They were the ordinary equipment of adulthood in a decade when the alternative to fixing something was going without it, and going without it was not always survivable. Skills had direct economic value in the Depression household that they carry no longer. A mechanic who fixed a neighbor's car in exchange for a week's worth of eggs had converted knowledge into food without any institution involved. A woman who could sew with enough skill to take in clothing alterations for pay had a second income that required no employer and no commute and no credentials. Practical knowledge was currency in the barter economy, and it was insurance against the cash economy's failures, and the households that accumulated the most of it were the best positioned to weather whatever the decade brought next. This made skill acquisition a household priority in the 1930s, in the way that credential acquisition is a household priority now, with the difference that the skills accumulated in the 1930s reduced your dependence on systems outside your control, while credentials acquired now tend to increase your dependence on those same systems. The concept that would eventually dismantle this culture was formulated, with remarkable irony, during the Depression itself. In 1932, a New York real estate broker named Bernard London published a paper titled "Ending the Depression Through Planned Obsolescence," in which he proposed that consumer goods including shoes, homes, machines, and agricultural products should be assigned government-mandated expiration dates, after which they would be legally required to be discarded and replaced. London's specific proposal was never enacted, but its underlying logic, that an economy built on consumption required goods to stop working at a predictable rate rather than being repaired indefinitely, became the organizing principle of post-war American manufacturing. General Motors President Alfred P. Sloan had been executing a version of this strategy since the 1920s, introducing annual cosmetic changes to car models to make the previous year's design look dated, even when it still ran perfectly. In the 1930s, the average American kept a car for about 5 years. By the mid-1950s, that figure had dropped to 2 or 3 years. The car had not gotten worse. The culture around it had changed. In 1954, industrial designer Brooks Stevens stood at an advertising conference and offered the clearest definition of where the post-war economy was heading. Planned obsolescence, he said, meant instilling in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than is necessary. That sentence described a project that required, as its precondition, the elimination of the repair habit. A buyer who fixes what breaks does not buy again on schedule. A household that knows how to resole a shoe is a household that does not need to buy shoes as often as the shoe manufacturer requires. The service economy built around replacing rather than repairing needed consumers who could not fix things, or who believed that fixing was beneath the modern standard of living. or who could not find the parts or instructions to fix something even if they wanted to. The appliance manufacturers of the 1950s contributed to this project by making products progressively harder to repair as the decade advanced. Dummy knobs that controlled nothing were added to washing machines and ranges to create the impression of complexity without adding function. Refrigerators changed from rounded to sharp-edged profiles, and then acquired new colors, Bermuda pink and spring green appearing in Kelvinator's line, for no mechanical reason beyond making the previous year's model look insufficient. Each stylistic change made the household's existing appliance feel like a failure of taste rather than a working machine, and the machine that worked perfectly well but looked like the previous decade was a machine whose repair was psychologically harder to justify than its replacement. The practical knowledge itself began to drain from households as the post-war economy made repair progressively less convenient and less necessary. Children who grew up watching their fathers adjust engines and their mothers resole shoes grew up in houses that had mechanics for the car and stores that sold shoes at prices that made repair seem inefficient. They did not acquire the knowledge because they did not need it yet, and by the time the economy shifted and the need returned, the knowledge was not there to draw on. The transmission that had moved continuously between generations through demonstration and practice, the knowledge of how the stove worked and what the car needed and how to cut a new sole from salvaged rubber, broke when the practice stopped. Because that kind of knowledge does not survive in books the way it survives in hands. You can buy a new pair of shoes. They will last about as long as the manufacturer needs them to. You just saw how a culture of repair was systematically replaced by a culture of replacement, one dummy knob at a time. Coming up next, the depression habit of knowing your neighbors not as acquaintances but as resources, and why the post-war suburb was designed to make that specific kind of closeness unnecessary. Section 14. Knowing your neighbors as resources. When the cow went dry on one farm in Depression-era Oklahoma, the family did not simply go without milk. They had an arrangement with the family 2 properties over, and the arrangement was already understood and had been in place through a previous difficulty, and the milk came from their cow for the weeks the first one needed to recover. Later, the favor ran in the other direction, as it was always going to, because these were not charitable transactions. They were economic ones, and the economy they ran on was neighborhood proximity and accumulated mutual knowledge and the specific understanding that the person at the other end of the arrangement would be needed again, differently, before the season was out. You knew what your neighbors had, you knew what they were short of, and you knew what you could offer in return. That knowledge was not social, it was material. Depression households that survived the decade intact almost universally did so with help from people who lived near them. The sociological field studies conducted in the early 1930s documented this with enough specificity to make it unmistakable. Households with strong local ties endured prolonged hardship better than those that were isolated, not because community bonds provided emotional comfort, though they did, but because the practical functions of daily survival were being distributed across multiple households in ways that made each one more efficient than it could have been alone. Informal groups coordinated shared cooking in some neighborhoods, rotating the labor and fuel cost of preparing large quantities of food among several households so that no single family had to sustain the whole effort every day. Others pooled purchases of staple foods to buy in quantities large enough to access lower prices, dividing the goods at the door. Child supervision rotated among neighboring women so that several adults could each free a portion of their day for other work. None of this was organized by any institution. It was organized by proximity and necessity and the accumulated trust of people who had been watching each other navigate the same difficulties for years. The knowledge required for any of this to function was specific and continuous. You needed to know that the family across the alley had a surplus of eggs this week and needed flour. You needed to know that the man in the corner house could repair an engine and would do it in exchange for a day's labor on your fence. You needed to know which neighbor had a pressure canner and would share it during the August canning weeks, and which one kept chickens and occasionally had extra to sell for less than the market would charge. This was neighborhood knowledge in the original, practical sense, an inventory of human resources distributed across a small geography, maintained in real time by regular contact, and drawn on whenever a gap appeared in any single household's capacity. Social workers of the period noted that the Depression had, in certain respects, produced a kind of involuntary community wealth that the prosperity of the 1920s had begun to erode. Previous emphasis on competition and individual achievement had started to give way, under sustained pressure, to the older logic of neighbor helping neighbor. The post-war suburban house was designed to make that knowledge unnecessary. This was not an explicit intention in most cases, but it was a reliable effect. The house in Levittown or its equivalents came with a refrigerator, central heating, a car in the garage, and a grocery store, accessible by that car within a radius that required no walking and no conversation with anyone who lived near you. The suburb was laid out on curving residential streets rather than on the grid that had made dense neighborhood life possible, and many developments were built without sidewalks, which meant that the incidental contact between neighbors that built daily familiarity and eventually mutual knowledge had no physical channel through which to occur. The scholar Robert Putnam, whose research on the decline of American civic engagement became foundational after his book on the subject appeared in 2000, documented what these design choices produced over time. A steady, measurable collapse in the indicators of social connection that had been strongest in the generation that had lived through the Depression and the war. Membership in civic organizations fell. Informal socializing with neighbors fell. The percentage of Americans who reported no close friendships at all rose from 3% in 1990 to 12% in the early part of this century. Putnam attributed roughly a quarter of this decline to television, which privatized leisure and made the household self-entertaining in the evenings that had previously been spent in contact with neighbors and community members. Suburban sprawl and the commuting time it generated contributed another portion. But the underlying condition that allowed all of these factors to take hold was the post-war prosperity that made neighbor knowledge economically unnecessary in the first place. The Depression household had cultivated that knowledge because it could not survive without it. The post-war household had everything its immediate needs required already inside its own property line, and the neighbor 2 houses over was a pleasant acquaintance rather than a critical resource. Acquaintances require much less knowledge than resources do, and the knowledge that is not required is the knowledge that stops being gathered and eventually stops existing. The cow arrangement in Oklahoma worked because both families understood, without needing it stated, that the calculation ran in both directions and that no one kept formal score. That understanding required the kind of familiarity that comes only from years of proximity and repeated contact, and the shared experience of needing something and being given it, and giving something in return. The suburb produced familiarity of a different kind, pleasanter and more comfortable, and requiring nothing in particular of either party. It produced neighbors who waved from driveways and whose names you knew, and whose specific resources and capabilities and needs you did not. That was sufficient for the new arrangement. The new arrangement had no gaps that required anything more. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just saw how a form of community knowledge that ran on necessity was made obsolete by prosperity and pavement. Coming up next, the Depression habit of growing your own medicine, and why knowing which plants in the yard could treat a fever or a wound was the last skill to go. Section 15. Home remedies and medicinal knowledge. The mustard plaster sat on the chest for 10 to 15 minutes, and you knew it was working because the skin underneath went from warm to hot to something close to burning, which was the point. The preparation was made from powdered mustard and household flour, worked into a paste with tepid water, spread thick on brown paper, covered with gauze, the edges of the paper folded up to hold it in place. 3 parts linseed meal to 1 part mustard was another version, spread between 2 layers of flannel and applied as hot as could be tolerated, which retained its heat longer against the skin. Depression households kept the recipe in household memory the way they kept bread recipes in household memory, passed from a mother who had learned it from her mother, adapted over time, the proportions adjusted by experience. Chest colds, congestion, bronchitis. This was the treatment. It worked by drawing circulation to the surface and loosening what had settled in the lungs. Doctors of the 1930s sometimes recommended it. The households that used it rarely had access to doctors to recommend anything else. Before the 1950s, healthcare in the United States was funded privately, meaning that a visit to a physician cost money the household had to produce. And in a decade when 25% of the workforce was unemployed, and those still employed were often earning reduced wages, that money was not reliably available. The Depression household managed its own health the same way it managed everything else, with what it knew and what it had on hand, reserving professional care for the cases where the home treatment had clearly failed and the illness had progressed beyond what household knowledge could address. Doctors in rural communities understood this and sometimes accepted payment in whatever the family had, as earlier sections of this list have described. But the baseline assumption of Depression-era healthcare was that most ordinary illnesses, the colds and infections and fevers and digestive complaints that filled the weeks of any household's year, would be handled at home, and that handling them well required a body of knowledge that was kept and transmitted within the household itself. That knowledge was specific and practical, and organized by the same logic as the rest of household management, around what was freely available, what could be produced rather than purchased, and what had been demonstrated to work across multiple applications. Sassafras, which grew wild across much of the eastern United States, was brewed into a tea and used for stomach trouble, fever, skin problems, and as a general tonic, sometimes mixed with honey to treat influenza. Holly leaf tea reduced fever. Peach tree bark brewed into a tea treated kidney infections. Blackberry juice, administered plain, addressed diarrhea and stomach trouble reliably enough that it was agreed on across multiple regions and communities. Honey mixed with alum and sometimes vinegar and lemon was gargled for sore throats and sipped for colds, the combination cutting through congestion in a way that several participants in later oral history studies described with specific approval decades after the fact. Ginger root tea addressed nausea and measles and general stomach distress. Epsom salts went into soaking baths for sore muscles and injuries and were taken internally for constipation. Baking soda paste went on bee stings. Steam inhalation, the head held over a pot of simmering water with a cloth draped over both, opened congested sinuses the way nothing else the household could produce quite matched. These were not superstitions. Most of them were functional, their mechanisms imperfectly understood, but their effects reliable enough to have survived decades of repeated use and the informal quality control of households that could not afford treatments that failed. The knowledge had been gathered and refined over generations in exactly the way Louise Nelson, a writer who grew up in western North Carolina in the 1920s and 1930s, described it in her documentation of regional folk practice. Remedies passed from mother to daughter, adapted over time, the ones that worked retained, and the ones that did not quietly discarded. Nearly all of them read like recipes, because they were kept like recipes, in the same household memory that stored the proportions for biscuits and the timing for preserves. What dissolved this knowledge was a combination of forces that arrived together in the post-war decade and reinforced each other. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 passed after a sulfonamide preparation killed more than 100 people when a manufacturer dissolved the drug in a toxic solvent without testing it, established federal oversight of pharmaceutical safety, and began the systematic process of defining which treatments were legitimate and which were not. The intent was safety and the need was real, but the effect over the following decades was to establish the physician's prescription and the pharmaceutical company's product as the exclusive legitimate authorities on health, and to frame household-managed treatment as something that reasonable people did only when they lacked access to proper care. Sulfa, the first drug shown to effectively treat bacterial infections, arrived in 1935. Penicillin became publicly available in the early 1940s. The expansion of employer-provided health insurance through the post-war labor agreements of the late 1940s and 1950s made doctor visits financially accessible to millions of working households for the first time. Each of these developments was genuinely beneficial. Together, they constructed the infrastructure of a medical economy that required the patient to depend on the system for every step of treatment, and that made household medical knowledge not illegal, but progressively more marginal and eventually invisible. The mustard plaster recipe left the household knowledge base not because it stopped working, but because the household stopped needing to use it. A child with chest congestion went to the pediatrician, who prescribed something from the pharmacist, and the visit and the prescription were covered or partially covered by the insurance plan the father's employer provided. The grandmother who knew the plaster recipe mentioned it occasionally and was listened to with the affectionate patience you give someone describing a world that no longer quite applies. The holly leaf tea, the peach bark decoction, the precise proportion of mustard to linseed, these had been functional for as long as anyone's memory reached, and they disappeared inside a generation once the conditions that had required them were removed. Your grandmother remembered the smell. She did not assume you needed to know the proportions. You just saw how a body of household medical knowledge assembled over generations was made obsolete not by being wrong but by being replaced. Coming up next, the depression habit that involved water and patience, and a specific kind of daily discipline that modern plumbing quietly made unnecessary. Section 16. The discipline of water. Heating water for a bath was a project, not a procedure. You filled the largest pots and kettles the kitchen had, set them on the stove, and waited for them to come to temperature while you did other things. Then carried them to wherever the galvanized washtub sat, and poured them in, and tested the temperature with your hand, and adjusted it with cold water added from the pump or the tap. The tub was in the kitchen in most households, near the stove, because that was where the heated water was, and moving heated water any significant distance required carrying it by hand, in vessels that weighed close to 8 pounds per gallon fully loaded. A bath for one person in a household without hot running water was a commitment of time and physical effort that made the water inside it too valuable to drain immediately. The next person used the same water. Then the water that remained was used for something else, floors, or laundry, or the garden, before it was finally allowed to leave the household. In 1940, according to census data compiled from housing surveys, nearly half of American houses lacked hot piped water, a bathtub or shower, or a flush toilet. Among rural households, the figures were more severe still. Approximately 50% of rural Americans lived without any plumbing at all, as late as 1950, often 2 full decades after electricity had reached the same communities. The gap between when a rural household got electricity and when it got running water was, in many documented cases, 20 years of continued management of water as a physically scarce and laboriously obtained resource, even as electric lights burned in every room. Helen Bolton, whose oral history is preserved through a Nebraska Living History project, described the Saturday night bath as a weekly household event in which several family members used the same tub of water in sequence, the cleanest members bathing first, and the water growing progressively less clear through the line. This was not considered degrading. It was simply how baths worked when heating the water required an hour of the stove's heat and the labor of carrying it. The washtub that held the bath water did double duty for laundry on the days that bath day and wash day did not coincide, which they often didn't, since laundry in the 1930s, in households without electricity, was an all-day undertaking conducted weekly rather than daily. In rural Florida, households of the period, as documented in local histories of that era, the same galvanized tub served both purposes, with laundry water heated separately in a large cast-iron boiling pot over an open fire outdoors, since the tub itself could not withstand the direct heat required to boil clothing properly. The sequence of uses that water moved through before it left a Depression household was long and deliberate. Cooking water went to vegetables, or to the stock pot. Washing up water from the dishes went to the floor. Laundry water went to mop the floors that followed the washing. What remained went to the garden. Nothing that had passed through the household left it without having served at least 2 purposes. This was not an ideology of conservation in the modern sense. The word conservation implies a choice, a decision made between using something and not using it. Depression households managed water this way because producing it required labor and in many cases expense, and wasting it was wasting the work that had been done to produce it. The Dust Bowl counties of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and surrounding states experienced something more acute than ordinary water management. The wells themselves went dry, and families carried water from distant sources in whatever containers they had, sometimes for considerable distances, and the water carried that far was not wasted by any standard anyone would have accepted as reasonable. Every function water could serve, it served. The automatic storage tank gas water heater, first patented by Norwegian engineer Edwin Rood in 1897 after he designed it in Philadelphia in 1889, was available throughout the Depression decade for households that had gas service and the money to install it. But even households with gas service and a water heater managed hot water with a discipline that the appliance did not eliminate, because the habit ran deeper than the necessity. The automatic heater made hot water continuously available without labor, which should have, and eventually did, change the household's relationship to water fundamentally. But it changed it slowly, because the people managing the household had formed their habits when water was not continuous, and its management required thought. The post-war suburban house arrived with indoor plumbing as a standard feature, a deliberate and marketed feature rather than an afterthought, because the housing developers understood that plumbing was a primary selling point for families who had grown up without it, or with inadequate versions of it. The houses in post-war Levittown and its successors had bathrooms with hot running water available instantly on demand, no heating required, no carrying required, no shared tub on Saturday night. The water came when you turned the tap and went when you opened the drain, and the volume available was effectively unlimited within the infrastructure's capacity, which was designed to be very large. By the late 1950s, middle-class home ownership and the consumer demand for modern bathrooms had made full plumbing nearly universal in new construction. As late as 1960, more than a quarter of houses in 16 states still lacked complete plumbing facilities. But the direction of the change was clear and moving fast. What disappeared along with the shared bath and the galvanized tub was the continuous household awareness of water as something that had been produced rather than simply supplied. The Depression household knew, without having to think about it deliberately, how much water was in the pot and what it had cost to get it there, and how many more uses remained in it before it left. The household that turned the tap held no such accounting. The tap simply ran, and the water simply went, and the monthly bill arrived later from a utility company whose infrastructure made the connection between the water and any effort to produce it invisible and irrelevant. The tub cooled off and was drained, and nobody came next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just saw how the discipline of treating water as a resource you had earned was dissolved by a tap that asked nothing of you. Coming up next, the Depression habit of never buying new when used would do, and why the secondhand economy your grandparents built their lives around was systematically dismantled by an industry that needed the new to feel necessary. Section 17. Never buying new when used would do. The rummage sale was set up in the church hall on a Saturday morning, and what was on the tables had come from households in the congregation that had something to spare, and from households that needed money more than they needed the object. Clothing sorted into sizes. Kitchenware that still worked but had been replaced by something else. Tools. Furniture carried in pieces through the door and reassembled on the floor. The prices were written in pencil on tags, and were low enough to make the thing accessible rather than profitable, because the point was not margin but movement. Goods from households that had them in excess to households that needed them and could not pay the price a store would charge. No one was embarrassed to be there. During the worst years of the Depression, the rummage sale was simply where goods went when they changed hands, the same as they had always gone, except that more hands were changing more goods, and the pace of it had increased, because need had increased. Goodwill Industries had been operating since 1902, founded in Boston by a Methodist minister named Edgar Helms, who hired marginalized workers to repair donated items and resell them, creating employment and distributing goods simultaneously. The Salvation Army followed a similar model, and by the time the stock market crashed in 1929, more than half of the Salvation Army's annual budget was generated by its resale store sales. By 1935, there were nearly 100 Goodwill stores operating nationwide. These organizations had worked for 3 decades before the Depression to overcome the stigma that had attached to secondhand goods in the American market. A stigma rooted partly in anti-immigrant prejudice against the rag dealers, many of them Jewish immigrants, who had sold used goods from carts and small shops since the 1890s, and partly in the Victorian-era association between worn objects and the poverty of their wearers. Thrift stores emulated department stores deliberately, staging fashion shows and reorganizing displays to demonstrate that something used could present as something respectable. The Depression resolved the stigma question more efficiently than any amount of display arrangement could have. When a quarter of the workforce had no income, and the households that still had income were living on reduced wages with uncertain futures, the question of whether it was socially acceptable to buy a used coat or a second-hand set of kitchen pots stopped having a meaningful answer. Everyone was buying used. The neighbor with a spare tool lent it or sold it for less than the hardware store charged. The family outgrowing one set of children's clothing passed it to the family whose children were smaller. The furniture that came into a household during the Depression years often came from someone else's household, and no one involved in the transaction considered this a failure of either party. The Depression had compressed the second-hand economy from a marginal parallel market into the dominant one, and the compression had happened fast enough that it carried with it almost no social cost. What the post-war economy needed to accomplish, and accomplished with remarkable speed and thoroughness, was the restoration of the stigma the Depression had destroyed. The mechanism was advertising, and the medium was television, and the argument being made was simple. A new thing was a better thing, and a household that owned new things was a household that had made it. The Salvation Army and Goodwill both observed the effect directly in their post-war donation records. As Americans spent their newfound wages on the latest appliances, clothing styles, and furnishings, they donated the previous generation of those same goods in increasing volumes, because owning last year's model had become something to move past rather than something to maintain. The donations increased. The customer base shifted. The person buying at Goodwill in 1955 was more likely to be shopping out of financial constraint than out of preference, because preference had been successfully redirected toward new. The advertising campaigns of the 1950s rarely attacked secondhand goods directly. They did not need to. They simply showed new things in aspirational contexts, placed them in the houses of people who were visibly comfortable and competent and modern, and allowed the viewer to draw the inference that the used equivalent represented a household that had not quite arrived. A refrigerator in the color of the current season was a refrigerator that said something about the family who owned it. The refrigerator it replaced said something too, and what it said was that the family had owned it when it was new and could now afford a newer one, and the appropriate thing to do with it was to pass it along rather than keep using it indefinitely. The planned obsolescence that had been described in 1954 as instilling in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than necessary, depended on the buyer having somewhere to put the still functional thing being replaced, and the charity thrift store solved that problem neatly, absorbing the discarded goods of the prosperous and redistributing them to those who had not yet reached the same level of consumption. The system that had been built to serve the depression habit of buying used was converted, in the post-war decade, into the infrastructure of disposal for the replacement habit. Your grandparents knew the rummage sale and the neighbor's spare parts and the church hall on Saturday morning. They knew what things cost new and what a fair price for a used one was, and how to assess whether what they were being offered still had enough useful life to justify the transaction. That knowledge was specific and practiced, and it produced a certain practical confidence around objects that their children and grandchildren, accustomed to buying new and disposing of what preceded the new, did not develop in the same way. The assessment of used goods requires knowing how long things last, what a worn versus a merely aged finish looks like, which kinds of damage are repairable and which are not. None of that knowledge is difficult to acquire, but none of it is acquired without practice, and the post-war economy arranged itself so that practice was not necessary. The new thing came in a box and worked immediately, and was covered by a warranty, and could be returned if it did not satisfy. The used thing required judgment. Judgment required experience. Experience required that you have bought used things before, assessed them, been wrong sometimes, learned from the wrongness, and bought used things again. The post-war economy declined to provide those conditions, and the habit dissolved inside a generation as the conditions for maintaining it disappeared. You just saw how a stigma was deliberately rebuilt after the Depression had dismantled it, and how that rebuilt stigma served the interests of everyone who needed you to buy new. Coming up next, the Depression habit of keeping chickens in town, and why the most practical source of protein a backyard could produce was the first thing zoning laws took away. Section 18. Keeping chickens in town. Every morning there was something to collect. You went out before the day had properly started, while the air was still cool and carrying the particular smell of feathers and straw and the dry mineral smell of packed earth in the coop, and you reached into each nesting box and took what was there. Some mornings 4 eggs, some mornings 7, some mornings nothing at all, from a hen that was resting or hadn't yet decided. You carried them back in your apron or your hands or a small basket, and by the time you reached the kitchen you had already made a set of decisions about what the week's meals would include, because the eggs determined that. The flock was small, 3 or 4 or 6 hens depending on the lot and the household's capacity to feed them, and they ate kitchen scraps and whatever they found scratching in the yard and the occasional supplement of cracked corn. They asked for almost nothing and produced with a reliability that was, in depression terms, close to miraculous. Keeping hens in town was not controversial in the 1930s. It was normal. Families in urban and suburban neighborhoods had kept backyard poultry since before anyone could remember, and few municipal codes had bothered to address the practice one way or another because it had not yet occurred to anyone to restrict it. The chicken was not a farm animal in the cultural imagination of the period. It was a household animal, closer in category to a tool than to livestock, as one later analysis of post-war zoning trends put it, something you kept in the yard that served a function, like a rain barrel or a cold frame. During both world wars, the federal government had actively encouraged backyard flocks, framing the keeping of hens as patriotic and the eggs they produced as a contribution to the national food supply. If the government could ask you to keep chickens for the war effort, the premise that keeping them was essentially agricultural rather than essentially domestic had not yet been established. The Depression made the economic argument for backyard hens visible to any household that thought through the numbers. A laying hen in good production could provide 5 to 6 eggs per week across the most productive months of the year. And a flock of 6 hens could supply a household's egg needs and produce a modest surplus to sell to neighbors who had smaller lots or no yard at all. Farms on roads between towns set up roadside stands, and in-town families knew they could make a short drive to the rural edge of the county with a few coins and return with fresh eggs. The price of a dozen eggs in 1937, adjusted for later prices, was roughly equivalent to $6.40, high enough relative to wages that producing your own rather than buying them made a meaningful difference to a household operating on a reduced budget. The scrap-fed hen converted kitchen waste into protein without requiring cash at the point of production, only labor and attention, and the Depression household had more labor available than cash. The end of the backyard flock did not come through a single decision or a single law. It came through the accumulation of forces that all moved in the same direction in the decade after the war ended. The new suburban subdivisions built by developers like Levitt & Sons included restrictive covenants as standard features, and those covenants prohibited the keeping of any livestock on the residential lots, because the product being sold was a certain kind of domestic order, and the chicken coop was incompatible with that order. Developers understood that the market for their houses depended on the houses appearing to belong to a particular category of modern living, and modern living, as they were defining and selling it, did not include animals kept for production. In areas where deed restrictions did not cover the question, municipalities wrote ordinances to fill the gap, banning livestock within city limits on the grounds of noise, odor, and the preservation of residential character. The newer the municipal code, the more certain it was to prohibit poultry, because newer codes had been written during or after the post-war era, when the desired residential category had already been established. The economics moved simultaneously with the zoning. Industrial poultry operations expanded rapidly through the 1950s, as factory farming techniques drove down the cost of commercially produced eggs. By 1969, the inflation-adjusted cost of a dozen eggs had fallen to the equivalent of about $4.36. By 1985, it was under $2. By the time egg prices fell that far, the economic argument for keeping backyard hens had largely inverted. It cost more to feed and maintain a small flock than it cost to buy the eggs those hens would have produced. The economic case that had made the Depression-era backyard flock rational had been systematically dismantled by industrial production that used scale and confined conditions to reduce the cost of eggs below what any household operation could match. The result, visible in the census data of poultry ownership, was the concentration of nearly all egg production into a small number of very large operations. By the early years of this century, roughly 86% of American eggs were produced by 63 companies, each keeping at least 1 million hens, and 99% of all laying hens in the country were owned by operations with flocks of at least 75,000. The backyard coop, which had been a normal feature of the residential yard in 1933, was by 1963 a violation of the deed restrictions in most new neighborhoods and a zoning offense in most incorporated towns. The ground where it had stood was seeded with grass, the coop itself dismantled, the flock dispersed or butchered. The egg now arrived from somewhere several hundred miles distant, in a carton, in a quantity standardized for a household that had no relationship to the hens that had produced it, and no knowledge of what feeding and keeping a hen actually required. Every morning there had been something to collect. Then there wasn't. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. You just saw how a reliable protein source that asked only for kitchen scraps and a small coop was zoned out of existence, one subdivision at a time. Coming up next, the Depression habit of saving seeds from what grew, and why the practice of keeping next year's garden in a paper envelope was the last act of agricultural independence the household ever surrendered. Section 19. Saving seeds. At the end of the season, after the last harvest, but before the first frost finished everything, someone walked the rows one more time and chose carefully. Not every tomato went to the table. The best one, the one that had set its fruit most reliably, or colored up most evenly, or tasted the way the family knew that variety was supposed to taste, was opened over a bowl, and the seeds were separated from the gel, and rinsed and spread on a cloth or a piece of newspaper to dry for a week in a warm room out of direct sunlight. When they were fully dry, they went into a paper envelope, and the envelope got a name written on it in pencil, whatever name the family used for that variety rather than any number or catalog designation. And the envelope went into a tin or a drawer where it would stay until March or April, when the decision about what to plant would not be a decision at all, because the seed was already there, already paid for, already proven in this soil under this sky by every season it had been grown before. Most Depression-era gardens ran on saved seed. Purchasing seed was possible, and seed catalogs circulated through rural communities during the 1930s, with companies cutting prices on staple varieties to accommodate the reduced household budgets of their customers. But the catalog purchase was a last resort, or a supplement for a variety the household did not already have, not the annual baseline. The baseline was the seed the household produced itself. A crop failure during the Depression was what one family history from the Dust Bowl years called a double loss. You lost the harvest that should have fed you through the winter, and you lost the seed that had gone into the ground, the genetic material you would have needed to plant again next year. The loss of seed was understood as the more serious of the two, because a missed harvest could be managed through other means, but lost seed could not simply be reconstituted. The knowledge attached to saved seed accumulated over time in ways that commercial seed could not replicate. A family that had grown the same bean variety for 15 or 20 years knew how that bean behaved in their soil specifically, which rows it set most heavily in, how it handled a dry summer versus a wet one, what the foliage looked like when the soil needed something it wasn't getting. They had been making selection decisions every year, choosing the strongest plants to save from, and the variety they were growing in 1935 was not quite the same variety their grandparents had planted, because each generation of selection had adapted it slightly to the particular conditions of that ground. The seed was not an inert object. It was a living document of the relationship between a family and their land, revised annually and stored in a paper envelope in a tin by the window. The commercial seed industry had been growing since before the Depression, but the development that would ultimately end the household seed-saving habit was taking shape precisely during the years when Depression families most depended on saved seed. Henry A. Wallace launched the Hybrid Corn Company in 1926, later renamed Pioneer Hybrid Corn Company, built specifically around the production and sale of first-generation hybrid, or F1, corn varieties. The F1 hybrid took advantage of a phenomenon called heterosis, or hybrid vigor, in which the cross of two distinct inbred lines produced offspring that dramatically outperformed either parent in yield and uniformity. Hybrid corn varieties overtook their open-pollinated predecessors at a pace that surprised even their developers. Nearly 100% of Corn Belt cultivation had converted to hybrid seed by the end of the 1930s, and the conversion was nationwide by 1960. The property that made F1 hybrid seeds commercially viable was the same property that made them useless for saving. The offspring of F1 hybrids, the F2 generation that would grow if a farmer planted seed saved from a hybrid crop, lose much of the hybrid vigor their parents displayed. They revert toward the inbred lines they came from, producing plants that are variable, unpredictable, and significantly lower yielding than the F1 generation. This was not a flaw in the commercial hybrid model. It was the structural feature that made the model possible. A farmer who planted hybrid corn had to return to the seed company every spring, because the seed produced by his own crop would not reliably reproduce what he had paid for. The annual purchase was not optional. The self-sufficiency of the saved seed system, which had required no ongoing commercial relationship and had given households complete control over their own planting material, had been replaced by a yearly dependency that was built into the biological structure of the product. The transition from saved to purchased seed happened gradually for garden vegetables, which resisted hybridization more easily than corn and remained mostly open-pollinated through the 1940s and into the 1950s. But the cultural shift had been set in motion. As commercial seed became more available, more affordable, and more associated with the modern scientific approach to gardening, and as the Depression receded into memory and the urgency that had made household seed saving essential relaxed, the practice contracted. It did not disappear. Gardeners continued to save seed from particularly good specimens, to trade envelopes of known varieties with neighbors, to keep the purple bean that had come from a grandmother's garden and that the catalogs did not carry. But the comprehensive, systematic household seed library, The tin containing 30 or 40 labeled envelopes representing every variety the family relied on for the year's food shrank across the post-war decades until what remained was a few favorites rather than a complete system. By 1975, the attrition had progressed far enough that a pair of Missouri gardeners named Kent and Diane Wheely founded what would become the Seed Savers Exchange, an organization built around the recognition that open-pollinated vegetable varieties were disappearing from the commercial seed trade, and that the households and small farms that had maintained them were doing so in isolation, without any system for preserving the genetic material if those households stopped growing. The varieties they were documenting and distributing had been in continuous cultivation in American households since before anyone organizing to save them had been born. The term used to describe them, heirloom, had been coined in the late 1930s by a horticulturist at the University of New Hampshire named J.R. Hepler, who applied it to beans he called family treasures. The envelope in the tin by the window held everything that grew next year. Then people stopped filling the envelopes, and the seed companies filled the gap, and the tin held nothing but the tin. You just saw how a practice that gave every household complete control over the following year's food was replaced by a product designed to make that control impossible. Coming up next, the final habit on this list, the one that ran through every other habit on it, the one that was not a skill or a practice, but a way of understanding what a household was for. Section 20. The productive household walk. Through a Depression-era house on an ordinary weekday, and you would have walked through a manufacturing operation. The kitchen was producing bread, preserves, and soap. The garden was producing vegetables that were already committed to specific meals and specific jars. The mending basket was processing clothing back into usefulness. The accounts book was tracking every input and output with the precision of a small business ledger. The root cellar was functioning as a warehouse for goods the household had produced and stored against future need. The cash tin held the household's reserve capital outside any institution. The seeds in the paper envelopes were next year's inventory, already owned and already accounted for. Every room in the house was doing something, and what it was doing was producing something the household needed, from materials the household controlled, through labor the household supplied. This was not a romantic arrangement. The work was continuous and physical, and distributed across everyone in the house, old enough to contribute, and the margin between what was produced and what was needed was never wide enough to feel comfortable. But the household that operated this way had a specific relationship to the commercial economy that was fundamentally different from the one it would later develop. It participated in the market selectively, buying what it could not produce, and nothing beyond that. And because it could produce a great deal, the list of things it needed to buy was short. A family that grew its own food, preserved its own harvest, made its own soap, heated only the room it occupied, kept its own hens, mended its own clothing, fixed its own appliances, saved its own seed, managed its own health with its own knowledge, and borrowed from neighbors rather than from institutions, was a family that the commercial economy could reach only at the edges. It was not a fully captive consumer. That was the problem. The 19 habits described before this one are all expressions of a single underlying orientation. The Depression household understood itself as productive first and consuming second, and it organized its time, knowledge, and physical space accordingly. The cash hidden in the tin behind the flour canister was not paranoia. It was the reserve capital of an enterprise that did not trust external institutions with its operating funds. The garden was not a hobby. It was a production facility. The mending basket was not sentiment. It was inventory management. The neighbor whose cow you had use of in exchange for your labor was not a charitable arrangement. It was a supply chain. Each of these 19 habits was a distinct department in an integrated system, and the system had a coherent logic. Reduce dependence on the market wherever the household's own labor and knowledge could substitute for what the market sold. What the post-war economy required was the dismantling of that system, department by department, over the course of roughly 2 decades, not through force, and not through any coordinated plan, but through the convergence of technology, policy, advertising, zoning, and cultural incentive that made each form of household production progressively less necessary and progressively less associated with competence. The refrigerator made the root cellar unnecessary, the supermarket made the garden optional, the dry cleaner and the department store made the mending basket an eccentricity. The gas furnace made the knowledge of drafts and heat management irrelevant. The credit card made the cash tin quaint. Zoning ordinances made the chicken coop illegal. Hybrid seed made the paper envelope with next year's tomatoes impractical. Each change was presented as a convenience, and in the immediate sense was one. None of them required you to give up anything you wanted to keep. They simply made keeping it less and less rational until most households stopped keeping it, and then stopped knowing it had ever existed to be kept. The household that emerged from this process on the other side was a different kind of entity than the one that had entered it. It was no longer primarily a site of production. It was primarily a site of consumption, and its function in the economy had changed accordingly. Where the Depression household had reduced its market exposure through self-sufficiency, the post-war household increased its market exposure through each room and appliance and utility relationship and debt instrument and professional service it added. The new arrangement was more comfortable. It was also more fragile in a specific way. A household whose food, heat, health, clothing, and capital all flow from systems outside its own walls has no fallback if those systems fail. The Depression household had been built around the assumption that systems fail, and it had therefore maintained parallel capacity at every point where the formal economy might prove unreliable. The post-war household was built on the assumption that systems don't fail, which is a reasonable assumption in prosperous times and a dangerous one when they do. Your grandparents' house knew how to do things, yours does not. The kitchen had the recipes for soap, and the knowledge of which plants in the yard addressed which ailments, and the layout of the root cellar, and the sequence in which bathwater could be reused, and the name of the neighbor whose saw you could borrow in exchange for your labor on a particular afternoon in September. None of that knowledge was sentimental. All of it was functional. It represented the accumulated problem-solving of a household that could not afford to depend on the market for everything it needed, and had therefore learned, across a decade of compressed difficulty, to provide a remarkable portion of it for itself. The 20 habits described in this video are what that looked like in practice, spread across kitchens and backyards and church halls and neighbors' doorways from one end of the country to the other. They were real, and they worked, and they are, for most households, gone. It took less than a generation to dismantle most of them. Nobody explained, while it was happening, that a productive household was being converted into a consuming one, because that was not how the conversion was being sold. It was being sold as freedom from labor, which was partly true, and as modern comfort, which was true, and as prosperity made visible, which was also true. All of those things were real. The cost of them was also real, and it was paid quietly, in the form of knowledge that stopped being transmitted because the conditions that had required it stopped existing, and that nobody missed until the next time the conditions returned. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.